Hello everyone, kia ora and welcome to Merging to Main. Today we're going to be looking at DORA Metrics, not just the dashboard, but how you actually use them in your organization and what that means for the culture and change. We do have a quick poll up we'd love your input and answers into that we'll look at in a couple of minutes. And in the meantime, quickly introduce myself and Nathan. You may already know me. I'm Paul, now from Octopus, previously from Codefresh. And I'm dialing in from New Zealand, so for me it's nice and early in the morning. And we are very thankful to be joined today by Nathen Harvey, who I'll let introduce himself, but who is absolutely a fantastic person when it comes to DORA metrics. They should be used. So Nathen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Merging to Main. As Paul mentioned, my name is Nathen Harvey. I lead up DORA here at Google Cloud. I'm based in Annapolis, Maryland, so for me, it's near the end of the day. Time zones are an amazing, beautiful, sometimes frustrating thing. But right now, I think, timing works out well for both me and Paul, which is great. I'm ending my day, he's beginning his. As a developer advocate with Google Cloud, as I mentioned, I lead up DORA. And so I'm really excited to talk with all of you about exactly what is DORA. And I'm super excited to see how this poll is going. How are you using DORA today? And maybe just before I kick it back to Paul, I want to talk about some of the questions that you've also maybe been seeing on your screen. This is a little application that we have, conversations.dora.dev. When we think about metrics, I think one of the most important critical pieces of any metrics is that they help you start a conversation. What kind of conversations might you start? Well, that's really up to you and your team. But we felt that building this conversations.dora.dev might give you some questions to ponder as you head off on your journey of continuous improvement. So that's what you've been looking at for the past few minutes if you've joined us early. And I wonder what questions you might ask and answer based on what we see here.
Great. And being an interactive webinar, please do make use of both the chat and the Q&A features. We would love to have your input as we talk about DORA. It's a huge topic, and I'd love to know exactly what you're thinking and where your organization is at with it. Do feel free to jump in, ask questions, interrupt what we're saying through the chat. We'd love your input. So the first part of that we did for a poll, and we hopefully have some insight that Jenny's about to share. Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. She is our amazing organizer in the background. And we can see from here that for 2/3 of our audience, much like our customers, everyone is just getting started with DORA.
Excellent.
And for most of the rest of them, they have a dashboard. If they're using Codefresh, it's right there in the product. But the information on how to actually use it and make use of it is why we have this webinar. Because we do get asked a bit about what those metrics actually mean and how you're meant to function with them. I'd love to just pass over to Nathen for a little bit. He can talk about his history with DORA and how long he's been around the project and speak a little bit to some of those questions about why it came about in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Paul. So I've been around DORA since the very beginning. That's kind of not maybe the entire truth, but let me just sort of qualify that answer here a little bit. So it probably started back in maybe around 2011, if you believe it. There was a company called Puppet Labs who put out a survey called the State of DevOps Survey. And this was really reaching out to practitioners and professionals around the world to try to understand how are they thinking about that word DevOps. In 2011, it was relatively new. The word DevOps had only been around for 2 years. But that first survey and subsequent report kind of kicked off this whole thing. So for a number of years, Puppet Labs ran an annual report and annual survey and published an annual report called the State of DevOps Report. Around about 2014, another researcher joined the effort. Her name is Dr. Nicole Forsgren. So she came on to join the effort with Puppet and Jez Humble and Gene Kim to continue this research and bring a little bit more academic sort of grounding to the research and report. Eventually, Jez, Nicole, and Gene Kim founded a company called DORA. DORA was eventually acquired by Google Cloud. That was about 2018. And within Google Cloud, we've kept the research going. Now, this research is program and platform agnostic. It has always been and will continue to be. And it really seeks to answer this question: how do technology-driven teams get better at delivering value to their customers? And so it's very much focused on software delivery and operational performance. But of course, there's a lot to that, a lot to that. Oh, and I see we do have a question here. Laurent has asked, what is the meaning of DORA? Well, it's interesting that you should ask. DORA initially is an acronym for DevOps Research and Assessment. Today, though, we're kind of steering away from that acronym, and DORA just means DORA. So maybe it would be good for me to, start with a quick sort of introduction to DORA. What exactly do we mean when we're talking about DORA? I think you all, or maybe some of you, Paul, you've mentioned them, know of the DORA metrics. So let's just start there maybe. So I'm over on this website here. This is dora.dev, where we publish all of our research and our findings. And we'll, throughout the course of the next 40 minutes or so, we'll take a look at a couple of things here. But I want to start with those DORA metrics. DORA metrics are the thing that most people are familiar with when it comes to DORA. So let's take a quick look at those. And in order to do so, I'm just going to jump into what we call the DORA Quick Check. The DORA Quick Check is a freely available, anonymous survey that you can take with your team to really get a sense of how are you doing when it comes to measuring software delivery performance. And this is one of the key questions of the research study. How do you measure software delivery performance? In order to do that, we have found and validated 4 key measures for measuring software delivery performance. The first 2 of which are really talking about throughput. So how quickly are you able to move changes through your system? And to look at throughput, we ask 2 questions. The first is lead time. And this question is really trying to get at from the time a developer takes a change. What kind of change? Well, any kind of change. It could be a feature, it could be a configuration change, some small code, a large set of code, doesn't really matter what. But once we have that change and we've committed that change to the version control system, that's when our lead time timer starts, if you will. That timer ends once that change lands in production. So in other words, how long does it typically take for a change to the application or service that you're working on to go from committed all the way through to deployed? I'm just going to throw in some random answers here, but if you'd like to follow along, you can certainly do that from the comfort of your own laptop or tablet, wherever you happen to be logged in. All right, so lead time is one of our throughput metrics. Our other throughput metric is deployment frequency. How often are you pushing changes out to production, making those changes available to your users? So again, I'm just going to throw in some answer. Now, these throughput measures help us understand how fast are we able to move. That's good. We all want to move faster, but we have to be careful. We don't want to move fast and break everything. So we balance those throughput metrics out with some stability metrics. And again, we have 2 stability metrics here. The first one is the change fail percentage. I have a different name for it, a slightly different name for it, Paul. I call it the expletive rate, because it's what happens when you push something to production and, well, you shout out an expletive because, ooh, maybe we need to roll that thing back or push forward a hot fix. Have you ever experienced that, Paul?
Oh, there's been a couple of times I've seen that happen.
Yes, indeed.
Nothing like pushing something out to production and having the whole thing freeze.
Yes, it's never a good moment, is it? That pit in your stomach. Oof. Yes. Well,
certainly something you want to avoid.
Yeah, it is clearly something you want to avoid. So I'm going to throw in a random answer there. 28% of the time. I wish I could say I'd never worked on a system that was hitting that level of change failures, but I would be lying if I said I never have. Anyhow, all right.
Now, most organizations would believe there's a trade-off here. If you go slower, are you less likely to make mistakes?
Oh, that's a really good question. I want to come right back to that after I describe the last metric, if you don't mind.
Brilliant.
Yeah, great. Okay, so change failure rate, those expletives. When that happens, when an expletive is shouted out, what is your failed deployment recovery time? In other words, how long does it take you to go from expletive to, whew, everything's back to normal, our customers are happy, able to use the application? So I'm going to throw in an answer there. Now, to your question, I want to just kind of summarize these 4 metrics. We've got 2 for throughput and 2 for stability. And Paul, you asked if there's a trade-off. And certainly if you think about how we've approached software delivery for a long time across the industry, we do tend to think of them as trade-offs. We can either move fast or we can have a stable system. But honestly, the way that our data has revealed these 4 questions or these 4 metrics for over a decade, what we see consistently year in and year out in our data is that throughput and stability are not trade-offs of one another. In fact, they tend to move together. In order to be
That's really
fast,
interesting.
yes, yeah, it is
Just
really interesting. And one of the things that I like to kind of talk about when it comes to that trade-off, think about a security vulnerability, right? A security vulnerability that you just found. It's a day 0 vulnerability. When do you want to patch that? It's live in production. What do you think, Paul? When should we patch that?
as soon as you can.
As soon as possible, right? If you're an organization that embraces this idea that slow is safe, you will at some point have to move fast. And if you don't have the organizational muscle to move fast, what you're going to end up doing typically is removing all of the safeguards that you have in place and jamming a change through as fast as you possibly can.
And that's when things might break.
Yes, indeed. Then things might break, and you may end up in a much worse position than you were before. So what we see, though, in our data is that those teams that are performing well on all 4 metrics. And the teams that are performing not so well tend to perform poorly across all 4 metrics. They kind of move together in lockstep. So I think that's a really fascinating finding.
Yeah, because there was this whole startup idea about startups have to move fast and break stuff. But what you're saying here is the research is showing you can move fast without breaking things. That a good team can actually achieve both of those at the same time. It's not trading off one for the other.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. The other thing that's really important about these metrics, I think, and crucial to keep in mind, is that these metrics are asking, and if you look closely at the questions, each one of those questions starts with for the primary application or service that you're working on. So these metrics are really meant at the level of an application or service. We don't, by contrast, we don't ask a question like, how frequently does Google deploy to production? That number is very large and kind of meaningless. There's not a whole lot you can do with that. But understanding how frequently this particular application deploys to production, how frequently this particular application has one of those expletive moments, that's where we can really start to drive change.
Makes sense. So it's kind of drills down to like a team or a microservice level in the ideal use case.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the only thing I would caution about team is it really depends on the makeup of your team. In many instances, an application is managed by a cross-functional team. And one of the potential pitfalls that you might run into, depending on how your teams are organized, is back to that throughput and stability misalignment, if you will. If, for example, you have developers and you tell them those throughput metrics are yours, and then you have like a release team or an operations team, and you turn to them and say, those stability metrics, those are yours to look after. Imagine what happens then.
Well, there's an intentional organizational disconnect there. I mean, that would be difficult to navigate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it is really important that as a team or as a cross-functional team that we share all of these 4 metrics together. Now, back to this quick check. Once you've answered these 4 questions, we give you a baseline. This is how your team is performing today. And this is relative to all of the survey respondents that we've had over the years. And in this case, we get a number, 5.8. I can't tell you if that number is good or bad. Not yet, because this is just how we're doing today. What really tells us if this is good or bad is how are we doing 3 months ago? Or how are we going to be doing in 3 months from now? It's really about the trend and how that changes over time. But the more important question then, is this good or bad, is kind of making an assumption that we want to improve. So how do you get better? How do you improve across those 4 software delivery metrics? And this is where DORA goes much deeper and where the research really starts to shine. So I'm just going to pop over here to the research tab. And what you're going to see here, let me just zoom in a little bit so it's a little bit easier to see. Here we
Thanks,
go.
Nathan. We've got one question that's come up through the chat
Oh,
just on how
yeah.
the metrics are measured. Ken's asking about the lead time for change.
Yes.
Is there a standard around how you measure which commit's the first commit? Is it the
Oh,
point where you're going to go push it to production, or is it the point where you make the first change to the code?
this is a good question. And honestly, this question of when does the timer start and end is something that we debate and discuss all the time in the DORA community. And soon enough, I'll show you a link to join the DORA community. Here's what I would say is the place to start. The place to start is the first commit within that group of commits that's going to go to, well, actually, let me rewind here for a minute. Let's start at the moment of the deploy. So we've just deployed some change into production. How many commits are in that change? It's probably, possibly, more than one commit. So what is the lead time for those changes? What I would typically recommend is you take that deployment, whatever that artifact is that you've just deployed, and look for probably the median commit within there. So find sort of the median, the middle time, and say, this is what we're going to call our lead time for changes for this particular deployment. Sometimes organizations will look at the very first commit. Sometimes they will get an average across all of the commits. How long does it take every commit to get into production? For better and for worse, there are lots of different ways to do this. So how do you respond to that? I think the first thing that's really important is, as a team, you write down exactly what you mean when you're measuring these. Now, Codefresh and other tools capture these metrics for you already. So by default, what I would do is use whatever the tool that you're using provides, use that definition right out of the box. Make sure that you understand how it's defined and use it. And maybe in the future, have a plan to revisit how you're doing that with your team.
Makes sense. I mean, if it's a trending measurement and the measurement's not about the number, but the trend, as long as you do it the same way and it's the same basis you're working on, then the trend should work. You'll get an up or a downward trend. But if you change the measurement or the teams aren't consistently using the same measure, then I guess you'd have a little bit more noise in that data.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And also, it is important to remember that from one team to the next, the context is going to be different. So team A may define that metric slightly different than team B does. That's okay, as long as you're not comparing team A's performance to team B's performance and trying to figure out which team is better. In fact, I would argue that you should never do that. The team that is better is the team that's improved more over time. But so how
That's
do
a
you...
really good point.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's the immediate measurement and management thing, isn't it? If you've got a number between teams, how useful is it to compare that number between teams? How tempting for management. But from what I'm hearing, that's about the trend, not the numbers that really matter.
That's exactly right, Paul. In fact, that comparison, ooh, you know what they say, comparison is the thief of joy.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
that comparison across teams can set up some unhealthy competitive behaviors across the teams, can leave some poor impressions from managers as they're looking at teams. I would definitely advise against that.
So it would be both misleading and unwise to compare DORA metrics between teams.
Absolutely. Yes.
That's
Yes.
very good to know.
All right. So back over to this research model, this capabilities model that I have up here, right in the middle here, you'll see those software delivery performance metrics in green. Now, here's a couple more interesting things from the research. What we find is that these metrics are predictive of better organizational performance and better well-being for the people on your team. So organizational performance, like things like, profitability, market share, productivity, but also non-commercial things like, non-commercial things, which are also listed on that same thing. customer satisfaction, how happy are your customers with the services that you're providing, and so forth. But beyond organizational performance, these metrics are also predictive of better well-being for your teams. Better well-being is measured in things like burnout. We want burnout to go down. That makes well-being go up. Deployment pain, same thing. We want our deployments to be less painful. The amount of rework that we have to do as a team. So it is really good to have better software delivery performance. Your business and your
Completely.
customers get good value, but at least as importantly, you and your teammates get good value out of that, but through improved well-being.
And we know that improved well-being itself is also something that our investors and our managers do care about. It's really hard replacing an experienced developer. They walk out the door and most of their knowledge, most organizations I worked for, it's not documented. They've got a whole lot of stuff in their head that your organization doesn't want to lose. So where there's those direct business metrics, there's a bunch of indirect stuff around well-being that's super important too. It's a
Absolutely.
competitive advantage all of its own.
Absolutely. And so if those software delivery metrics are predictors of those things, we want to improve software delivery performance. The way that we do that, though, is we look at the capabilities that are predictive of better software delivery performance. And what DORA researches is exactly that, a number of different capabilities that we think, and then through our data, we validate are driving better software delivery performance. Capabilities like documentation, having good quality documentation for your systems is a tremendous driver to better software delivery performance. And then there are also a bunch of technical capabilities, things like practicing continuous integration and making sure that you're continuously integrating your code or merging to main, if you will, on a regular basis. This is really important. It's one of those technical practices and capabilities that really predicts better software delivery performance. And then beyond those technical capabilities, we also look at things like processes that you have within your organization. A good example of this is your change approval process. Many teams, as they're getting ready to ship a change out to production, have to send that change off to an external change approval board or change approval body that has to look at those changes and give some approval to them. What our research has demonstrated for a number of years is that those external change approval boards slow things down. Are you surprised to hear that, Paul?
Oh, not at all. I can imagine how frustrating it would be to have your new feature ready to ship and then wait 2 weeks to hear an answer from a board.
Yes. And it's super intuitive that that change approval board is going to slow you down. But what our data also shows is it does not decrease the risk of those changes. In fact, what we've seen is that with a heavyweight change approval process, you're slower and the chances of one of those expletive moments is much higher. So you're moving slower and you're less stable.
Oh, now that's really interesting. So the oversight board and the data you've seen actually arms the process and is more likely to lead to incidents in production than to avoid them.
That's exactly right. And it's entirely against the intent of that change approval board.
Mm.
We all know it was put there in good faith to help reduce risk, but we've seen through our data and through our lived experience that it simply doesn't work that well. The final area, though, that we really dig into in our research beyond technical and process is all about culture. And it is culture that we find that is foundational to how your team works. In fact, let's just jump over here to this article about generative organizational culture. I want to show you one of the things that we help assess and kind of talk about when we look at culture. We
Let's
lean
just
on
say,
some research from a sociologist named Dr. Ron Westrum. Westrum has studied a number of different organizations, mostly in safety critical areas. Think emergency rooms in the hospital, think nuclear power plants and things like this. What Westrum was able to do through his studies was to identify a topology of organizational culture. Each organization or team kind of fits into one or somewhere along this spectrum. You've got on the left-hand side the pathological or power-oriented organizations, in the middle, the bureaucratic or rule-oriented, and then on the right-hand side, the generative or performance-oriented organizations. And one of the ways that I like to think about and talk about this is what happens when something goes wrong on your team? When there is one of those, oh, expletive moments, or when you have an incident that brings things down and your customers aren't able to access your system? How does your team, how does your organization respond? In that pathological organization, you're going to see, as it says there, responsibilities shirked. Oh, nope, wasn't my fault. Maybe it
I
was
like how
Paul's
honest
fault.
those titles are.
Yes, yes. In the bureaucratic organization, what happens is people tend to follow the rules, regardless of whether or not the policies. Look, yeah, something broke, but I did everything by the book, so not my problem. But in that performance-oriented or generative organization, when something goes wrong, the team comes together and says, huh, I wonder what happened there. Let's dig in. Let's investigate. Let's see what we can learn from this incident. And not surprisingly, what our research shows is that those teams that are more generative, more performance-oriented, those teams, along with other characteristics of the teams, things like they're welcoming and everyone on the team feels like they belong. People are allowed to show up at work as their whole selves, right? And so they're diverse teams, they're performance-oriented teams. These are the teams that tend to perform the best.
That's fascinating. I mean, sociology is a side hobby of mine, particularly coming from New Zealand as a very multicultural society.
Yes.
So just the idea that the culture of the team can have such a huge impact is fascinating, especially. And again, it's out of topic for today, but that culture can be engineered in the same way we engineer software means that it is possible to move your team culture to that generative model over time. And that seems to
Yes.
have a huge amount of really good ROI attached to it. A lot of good business value from letting your teams operate in that generative model.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's super cool. Hey, it looks like we might have another question coming in, Paul.
Brilliant. Yeah, Ken. Ken has asked, is it always valid to use DORA metrics? Are there any scenarios where actually it's not valuable? And if it is valuable, how do you show that value? Is there any information on what the ROI is for using DORA metrics in an organization?
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Ken. I'm going to start at the end. Is there any study related to ROI? And for that, I'm going to jump over to the publications tab here. And towards the bottom of the page, we have exactly that, an ROI of DevOps transformation white paper. Now, this
Oh,
white
that's
paper,
perfect.
yeah, I would highly recommend downloading this, Ken. It will ask you to register for it. I happen to have a copy local. Give me 1 second and I'll pull it up. The thing about this ROI study that is really nice is that it gives a bunch of, oh, let me see. Here we go. Coming right up. Can you see that now?
Perfect. We can see
Yeah,
that.
great, great.
Excellent.
Okay, so I'm just going to scroll through it slowly as I talk about it. But one of the things that's really powerful about this is it gives you some financial formulas that you can use to talk with executives, talk with your team about both the cost of things like downtime, how much does it cost when we have an outage, the cost of things like rework, when I ship something to production and I have to pull it back and rework that. I'm scrolling to find some of those formulas. So here's a formula as an example. This one is looking at the cost of unnecessary rework and the cost avoidance of that rework. It goes on to lay out a number of different scenarios here and give a lot of that guidance. So I would strongly recommend grabbing this ROI report. It can give you a lot of good insight into how to measure this. Now, back to Ken's question about, is it always valid to use DORA metrics? If for example, we're already capturing things like cycle time. This is a great question, Ken. I would say that, is it always valuable? Maybe. If you're already capturing cycle time, then lead time for changes is part of cycle time. And for most people, cycle time is kind of like, we have an idea. Oh, let's begin the cycle time. We get it all the way through. We ship it out to a customer, and the customer says, "Thank you." Oh, let's stop the timer. So maybe from idea to thank you, maybe that's the entirety of that cycle time. Whereas the lead time for changes is much, much smaller. Now, They're both valuable, I think, because the thing that you're really looking for when you're looking at those times is where is the constraint? Where is the bottleneck, right? And the lead time for change, and part of the reason that the DORA research focuses on that is that we've seen that consistently be a bottleneck. And certainly if you go back to when the survey started, 2011, this was a huge bottleneck. Maybe in some organizations, that bottleneck has been alleviated. But in my lived experience, there are still lots of organizations that struggle with actual software delivery. Now, another reason that the research has focused there, well, two more reasons. One is that word that I just used, focus. As a research study, we have to pick an area of focus. We can't just study the entire world. Boy, we would love to do that, though. And then the second reason is we have this hypothesis that coming up with an idea and arranging work and architecting that change, that new idea that you're going to ship, all of that has a lot of variability in it in terms of the size of the idea, the scope of the changes that you're going to need to make, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to software delivery, our hypothesis is that from code commit to production, should be a pretty well-defined path with not a lot of variability in that part of the process. So we are definitely not looking at the full value chain. We're focusing in on the software delivery process, but it still gives us lots of insights. And in fact, the way that you might use that research then, if I just come back to this, if what we're finding is that our metrics are going in the wrong direction, what DORA encourages us to do is to look at these capabilities and not fix all of them, not try to improve all of them, but rather find a capability that is holding you back. So maybe on your team, you see that you have a lot of challenges with test automation. This might be a good place to invest. On another team, they may have a problem with that change approval process. This is a better place for them to invest. And so you can really use this research to kind of fit to purpose. How do we help our team improve and make those improvements?
You can find the pain points.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Fascinating. So ideally, the value about DORA metrics isn't so much the metrics themselves, but the things that contribute into it and the ability to find which part of the organization could be improved for the largest impact.
That's absolutely right. The numbers, the metrics themselves, I think truly are there to help you start a conversation. What does that conversation look like? Well, it looks like we'd like to improve these metrics. Where should we invest in improving? And the whole idea behind DORA, I mentioned DevOps research and assessment, and I try to not use that word DevOps too frequently. DORA really comes down to this phrase here. How do we help teams get better at getting better? This truly is a journey of continuous improvement where you and your team are going to take small iterative steps every day, every week, every month to help drive that change and drive that improvement.
So it sounds like DORA is not so much about the maths or the science or the dashboard, but far more about understanding how people and processes relate and figuring out where you can improve that process to make it better for people.
Well, very well said, Paul. I will say that, DORA is absolutely science-based. We do, as I mentioned, we run a survey every year. We collect data from around the world. And this is another really interesting and good thing about our survey collection is that we're talking to people, professionals in organizations of every shape and size and in every industry vertical. When it comes to things like improving software delivery performance, I sometimes hear people say, well, we're in a highly regulated industry. We simply can't move fast. We simply can't improve, which is, we've shown through our data over the years that that's simply not true. We see teams in highly regulated organizations, in government agencies, in financial services, in healthcare. They're able to perform at the same level as organizations in, say, technology or retail, something that is completely different to how they're working. We see these performance measures going really well across basically every industry.
That's a really encouraging thing to hear because to get those measures performing really well, means a culture for developers where there's less roadblocks and a better developer experience. And so what you're saying here is that there's no particular industry or vertical that means you have to have a bad developer experience, that you're seeing data from across the entire scope of industry that you can have a good developer experience regardless of what industry your company's in.
Absolutely correct. Yes. Yes, indeed. Indeed. And it is truly about that developer experience, as a developer, a frictionless environment where I can stay focused on the work that I'm doing. I don't have a tremendous amount of cognitive overload. I'm able
Mm.
to focus on delivering value and delivering value with technology. That is super critical.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we know from we're biased between Codefresh and Octopus, we're deployment tools. We know that the market wants quicker delivery, better delivery, getting more value out of developers quicker. But what's really encouraging here is that the research behind DORA is showing that that's part of a bigger picture, and that bigger picture of best practice is achievable by everyone.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that we found in 2023 in our research, our latest research, we looked into this idea of user centrism, or how focused on the user is your team. And we measured that with things like asking questions like, have you recently used feedback from users to change the things that you're planning on working on? Has user feedback impacted your roadmap? And what we found was that teams that are focused on the users, they had 40% higher organizational performance and 20% higher team performance. And sorry, 20% higher job satisfaction. So think about this as a
Interesting.
developer. As a
Mm.
developer, I'm building things not just to build things. I'm building things to serve the users, to bring benefit to the users, and through that, value to my business. And so we found that teams where the developers were connected to those users and the outcomes that the users wanted, those teams performed much, much better. And the developers on the team were happier.
It's always nice to get that feedback from customers too, where they're like, you solved my problem.
Yes.
Certainly, we know that looking at development teams, there's that tension between, what sales wants for the next potential customer or what the board wants for the vision for the product versus what customers want who are using it now. And so what I'm hearing, and again, I'm a little bit biased, but that serving the customer's needs is part of what makes the developers' jobs really satisfying, and having that feedback loop about being able to solve a problem that they know is an immediate problem and gives value straight away is really valuable.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing that we found that was really interesting last year, um, teams and interesting, maybe not surprising, but teams with faster code reviews had about a 50% better software delivery performance measures.
Interesting. That's another process that can take a long time, can't it?
It absolutely can. It can take a long time. And the other thing that I find fascinating about code reviews, in DORA, we look at technical practices, we look at process, we look at culture. I think all three of those things impact your code reviews,
Mm, that
right?
would make sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's certainly tooling that can help you with faster code reviews, but if you ignore the process pieces of it and the cultural pieces of it,
Yeah, then it becomes an issue. Yep. Does Nathan sound? You've just dropped off, Nathan. Give us a second while we're going to get Nathan back. If you can hear me, please let us know in the chat that we know Zoom hasn't killed all the audio. Okay, brilliant. So Zoom hasn't killed all of us, but unfortunately, Zoom has temporarily taken Nathan out of the picture. He'll be back with us very soon. He's working to get audio restored now. Hopefully, it won't take long. So while we have a gap in the discussion, if you have more questions, we have about 20 minutes more of Nathan's time. And this is a great moment to start gathering a bunch of questions when he comes back to us with audio that we can ask him about. So far, we've covered a whole lot of stuff around what DORA can be used and how it can improve culture and performance. But we've gone through this quite quickly. If there are areas that were particularly interesting to you or speak to your workplace, do send through some questions for us.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
There we go. Nathan's back. Brilliant.
All right.
Good to have you back.
I'm not sure what happened, and I imagine the quality of my mic is a little bit less now, but that's fine. At least you can hear me. Hearing me a little bit is better than not hearing me at all.
Absolutely. Hardly any quality change. It's great to have you back with us.
Great.
I can hear you quite clearly.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And it looks like we do have a question again from Laurent.
We do. So Laurent's asking, where do you start improving? Is it in your tools, in your culture? How do you identify if you start using DORA, which is the top of the list of things to improve on?
Oh, yes. This is a really fun question. And I hate to disappoint. The answer is it depends. It depends. But you maybe knew that that was the answer that was coming. I want to just come back to the quick check and kind of talk through this for a second. So remember, we took that quick check and we got this score of 5.8. And then we said, well, how do we improve? And we looked at the research model a little bit. One of the things that we also do in the quick check, though, is we help you assess 3 of those capabilities. And we're going to look at a technical capability, a process capability, and a cultural capability. And this can help you start to zero in on which thing is holding me back. And so, again, I'm just going to throw in some random answers here, but I want to talk a little bit about sort of survey design as well. We can't just ask teams, are you practicing continuous integration? Yes or no? Because what does that even mean? And every survey respondent might have a different understanding of that term in their head. So instead, in the survey, we don't even mention continuous integration. Instead, what we do is ask questions about the capabilities or sort of the characteristics of continuous integration. And you can also see here how we ask the questions. In fact, they aren't necessarily questions. They're much more statements, and we ask the extent to which you agree or disagree with the statements that we've made. For example, code commits result in an automated build of the software. Code commits result in a series of automated tests being run. I'm just going to throw in some random answers here, and I'm not going to read them all.
Good statements.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the continuous integration ones. Next up, we have loosely coupled architecture, which you might argue is really more loosely coupled teams if you describe it. Again, I won't read the answers. I'm just going to throw in some quick, or the questions. I'm just going to throw in some quick answers here. And then finally, the cultural questions to help assess, are you generative culture, like, failures are treated primarily as opportunities to improve the system. Do you agree or disagree with that? So now with those randomly generated answers thrown into that, we get a stack ranking. And so now, Laurent, if this was your team and you looked at continuous integration, loosely coupled architecture, or culture, I would tell you for that team, continuous integration is absolutely the place to start. That's the bottleneck. It's the thing that's holding you back. You could certainly improve your organizational culture a little bit, but at the end of the day, that's less likely to have any impact on your overall software delivery performance. Now,
we're going back to the 80-20 rule, right? So trying to find out where your effort has the biggest impact.
Yes, absolutely. Find out where your effort has the biggest impact. And when you're here on the site, just like I showed you with the generative culture, we have an article, a capability article for each one of these. And the articles typically follow this pattern where we describe what the thing is, in this case, continuous integration. How do you implement CI? What are some of the objections that your team or your organization might raise as you go down this journey of getting better at continuous integration? Some of the common pitfalls that you want to watch out for, and then importantly, ways to measure it. Oh, so here we go again with metrics. So now we can actually set some team level goals, maybe OKRs, if that's the process that you use, around continuous integration. And then just tying it all back together, if continuous integration is where we're improving, what we can do is essentially state a hypothesis. we believe that by improving our continuous integration practices, that's going to predict or drive better software delivery performance, which is going to drive that organizational performance and help with our team well-being. So the place to start, Laurent, is to have a conversation. Have a conversation with your team, with that cross-functional team. Find where's the bottleneck, where's the pain for your developers, and go try to alleviate that bottleneck or that pain. And then rinse and repeat. This is absolutely a journey of continuous improvement.
Brilliant. So those surveys, those quick checks, quick checking surveys on Dora.dev, aren't they? That are a great way to make use out of these metrics and see what sort of business insight you can get out of it.
Absolutely. And a quick tip, we don't store any of that data, but all of the answers are encoded in the URL, which means that you can bookmark your results page and you can revisit it later and compare how were my results 3 months ago versus how are they today.
That's getting the trend out of it again, isn't it? It's this idea that you want to check on the trend of where you're going rather than exactly where you are right now.
Yep. Looks like
Brilliant.
another question.
Yeah, Ken has asked, are we measuring deployments of individual components or the whole group of components all at once?
Yeah, this is a really good question. What I would do, or the advice that I would give there is that you want to look at an application or a service. So, that can even be tricky. What do I mean when I say an application or a service? This application, maybe it's a retail application with some shopping capabilities. That's made up of many microservices. Well, then I would say look at the service level. So in each one of those microservices, how frequently you're deploying, what is your lead time for changes, and so forth. There is a little bit of a thing to keep in mind, though, with microservices. Sometimes your microservices applications are not independently deployable microservices. In fact, you have to deploy all of the microservices together. If that's the case, it's probably not a microservice anymore. It's really a monolith, maybe that's spread across multiple different smaller services. But when you build in those dependencies, that is one of the things that you want to watch out for. So to answer the question there, Ken, I would say go at the service level, and hopefully your services are small enough or at least independently deployable. And speaking of small enough, I think that's one of the other sort of key insights from DORA. When the way to achieve that speed and stability moving together is to focus on flow of change through the system, and smaller changes where we get faster feedback is probably the best way to achieve better software delivery performance.
Well, it makes sense to break it into as small a component as possible. Certainly, you see a huge difference between washing a cat versus washing a dog. The dog being a much bigger unit of work is a lot easier to do. If you've ever tried washing a cat before, it's a lot more of an agile, smaller process.
Yes.
So again, if you can break your software down into cats rather than dogs, they can move a lot quicker and be a lot more responsive. So you can make use of these metrics in a much more immediate way. Ken's also asked a fantastically contentious question here. Why do we advocate for trunk-based development over Git flow in terms of models of how Git is used?
Oh, yes. This is a very good question. And trunk-based development, of course, is one of the very often talked about conversations or capabilities that we have that we discuss. Look, here's the thing. When you have Git flow, you end up with lots and lots of branches. And branches are a good way to separate code from each other, and in many instances, hide code from each other. Long-lived branches, what we've found in our research is that long-lived branches tend to cause a lot of pain when you try to bring them back in and merge them back together. And so it is that what we see in our data is that teams with a small number of branches that live for a short period of time tend to have better software delivery performance outcomes. My own personal experience, I've of course used Git flow in the past, and I definitely prefer something much closer to trunk-based development. practicing continuous integration, doing smaller changes, and really merging those changes very frequently, at least daily, back into the main line. We find that really drives better software delivery performance. To be fair, there have been some interesting findings over the last couple of years around what mechanisms do we have in place to support a practice of trunk-based development? And if you don't have good mechanisms in place to support that, what kind of mechanisms? Documentation, testing so that you're getting fast feedback, it's a good, healthy culture so that you understand that sometimes things will break. And when they do, in a test-based or a trunk-based development environment, our top priority is recovering from that breakage. Let's all focus on that. When you have those things in place, trunk-based development works really well. When you don't have some of those things in place, just watch out for burnout on your team, especially maybe folks that are newer to the team or joining, and trunk-based development is a new practice for them.
Makes sense. So again, it's that same theme we've come back to a couple of times. The smaller the unit of work, the easier it is to measure and improve. And what I'm hearing is if you are merging into your main branch every day, that's a smaller unit of work than a feature branch that's lived for 6 months and has developed entirely separate to the main branch.
Yes, yes. Boy, we're coming up on time, but maybe we have time for one more question. Is there another one?
We've got 2 more questions.
Oh.
We're going with the one that came into us first. We have a question from our audience saying, do DORA metrics affect teams who are outside of DevOps or software development? Like, does DORA have anything to say about support, customer service, sales, and other parts of the organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. So certainly we look at software delivery performance. DORA also looks at operational performance, which is slightly different than software delivery performance. Operational performance is like, once I've shipped the software, is the service running reliably? And there we investigate, some practices that we've learned or borrowed from the SRE world, that of course is part of Google and a part of a much larger community. Those SRE practices make sure that we're, setting service level indicators and really thinking about our applications in terms of how do the users experience them. And so there's certainly some things there. And then when it comes to things like customer service and support, boy, we talked earlier about getting that user feedback and how important that is. Sales, the same thing. We want to get that user feedback so that we're building the right things as well as building them the right way.
Makes good sense. Last couple of quick things. Bart is asking, how do you start measuring those 4 key metrics? Just jumping in here, if you are using a advanced CI or CD platform, they're becoming built in. They certainly are for Codefresh. It's already there as a dashboard. But if you don't have a tool that does this automatically for you, where do you start?
Yeah, so I fully agree that if you have the tool, use the tool. The next best place to start is with the DORA Quick Check, or potentially one of my other favorite tools. I'm going to hold it up and show it on the screen. A set of Post-its, If you go into your retrospective or your planning session and ask those questions about those 4 key metrics, write them down on a Post-it, stick them on the wall, and next time you're doing a retrospective, do the same. See how that is trending over time. This is a great possible, feasible way to capture those metrics. So if you have a tool, use the tool. If you don't have the tool, use the quick check, use Post-its, use the conversation, because it's not about the numbers, it's about the improvement work that you're going to do. Those numbers can be kind of a compass to help you see which direction we're going, but the way that we're going to improve or move further down is by taking steps. Those are the improvements.
And those numbers and dashboards don't do anything about the conversations anyway. So whatever you use, feed it into a conversation, a retrospective process, part of the ongoing topic in the team, what you talk about. Because otherwise, no matter what tool you're using, it's not going to be useful if it's not part of what feeds into the people and the culture and the priority setting.
Yes.
Yes. Last thing we wanted to cover in our last couple of minutes is, where can people learn more about this? Now, we've looked at the DORA Dev site a lot today. What other resources are out there that people can tap into and learn about how to improve?
Yeah, so first, DORA.dev, of course, we've looked a lot at that if you look at the upper right-hand corner, I won't pull it up on this. Well, maybe I will. I'll just share my screen really quickly. So also on Dora.dev, you'll find a link here to community. Oh, let me hit the share button. There we go. So right here on Dora.dev, you'll see a link to community. Here we have a worldwide community of practitioners, leaders, researchers, all trying to understand how do we put this Dora into practice. The truth is, I don't have all the answers, but together as a community, we can get there. So I would strongly encourage you to click this button, join the Dora community. It's a mailing list. We hold online events regularly, so you can come and join the discussion. We even have a calendar of events where, oh, look, merging to Maine shows up right there on the calendar. So we try to put things like this onto our Dora calendar there as well. So that's probably the best resources are Dora.dev and the Dora community. But I want to just call out one other thing quickly. The 2024 Dora survey is open now. How can a survey help me learn? Well, here's my take on that. If you take the survey and carefully consider the questions as you're going through, I believe that you're going to start to find places where, as a team, you're doing really well, and as a team, you have places to improve. So I would highly recommend that you get your team to take the survey and then come together in a meeting, a retrospective, etc., and talk about the survey. You might have identified something that you want to try differently tomorrow just by taking the survey. It's a great moment for reflection.
Fantastic. That's a very good idea. Now, we will post information about these resources and links to them on this recording when it hits YouTube. We'll hopefully also remember to post these things in our socials as we promote the talk afterwards. If you have any questions, though, get in contact with Nathen or I through any of these videos you've seen us marketing's talk. We'll be happy to help point you in the direction where you can get some more information. That's all we really have time for. I know we've got some great questions that are still sitting there unanswered, and it's a conversation that we'd love to continue. As again, Dora's value is in that continuous conversation. But for these, you might need to keep asking questions on the YouTube video or in our socials because we're out of time. Really appreciate everyone who's showing up, and especially those who have asked questions of us and contributed to the conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you, Nathen, for your time. It's been great having you here.
Thank you, Paul. It's really been my pleasure.
Awesome. I know my last obligation as your host is to remind everyone that there are more events coming up. Codefresh has a whole events page and more conversations like this. If you have ideas what you want to look at next, let me know. Our next major event is looking at app promotion made easy with Argo CD. We've got some great stuff around that to, again, take the pain out of the developer process, make it easy for developers to enjoy their work. Do come along to that if you're using Argo CD. Other than that, we will see you merging for Maine again in a couple of weeks, looking at why you should be engaged in your community, what that looks like, what the value is, how to convince your managers it's a good idea. And we'll catch you then. For now, we will, again, pick up the conversation about Dora in the YouTube video and in the socials. And follow Nathen's work. He's got a whole lot of stuff he's published, more talks he appears in. If you want to catch him again live to ask more questions, no doubt there'll be an opportunity soon. So thank you very much for your time, Nathen. Thank you very much for everyone who's come along. And that's us for today. Greatly appreciate you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.